Way back when, before I was ordained, I was leading a service at the Unitarian Universalist Church in Orlando, Florida, and I was reading the script that was standard for that church. And, you know, it starts with an elevator speech. Every UU service starts with an elevator speech or something to remind us who we are for newcomers or tell us who we are. That morning, I said the following words from the script. We look for the worth and dignity of all people, and knowing that we are part of a web of connections that expands beyond our imagination, we strive as best we know how to build on our deepest values to bring justice and compassion to the world. On our journey together, we welcome all of whatever race, class, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender identity, religious background, or physical ability. We welcome you. After the service that Sunday, a congregant came up to me and said, "Why did you call out class in the opening words?" They said, "I get why we talk about race and sexual orientation, religious background, and all these others, but why did you specifically call out class?" I didn't want to admit it was because it was the words written on the piece of paper at the time. I didn't have a really great response for it because we do talk a lot about isms in Unitarian Universalism. In particular, we've talked a lot about race in the last decade. We've talked a lot about sexism and heterosexism and gender identity. They're often at the top of our awareness. We are keenly aware of people who don't identify as Christians in a country where that is considered to be the standard for many. But what about class? Well, we've spoken about income inequality, right? Does that count? We've talked about equal access for voting, healthcare, and education, but is that really addressing class? My hypothesis is that we as Unitarian Universalists are still quite classist, and that, like many isms, we are often unaware of it. But that classism is still real, and we still struggle with it. But many people don't understand how much classism is also a part of our Unitarian Universalist DNA. For those of you who are new to Unitarian Universalism, that unwieldy name of our denomination comes from a merger of the Unitarians and the Universalists that happened on May 12th, 1961. Yes, it is the 63rd anniversary of that merger today. Let me tell you a little bit about our denominational ancestors and how the story of class is interwoven into that story. And it's important to acknowledge this history because, as Alice Walker says, to acknowledge our ancestors means that we are aware that we did not make ourselves. So here's the Universalists. The Universalist side of our denomination was founded in 1770 by John Murray. He was an Englishman who showed up in New Jersey and befriended a farmer named Thomas Potter. Yes, we have a puppet show about the famous landing of John Murray that we need to bring back at some point from the pandemic. Murray started preaching in the very humble church that Thomas Potter had built with his own hands. Murray preached the revolutionary idea that all people were saved, not just a few chosen ones. He spread his message beyond Thomas Potter's barn far and wide through other small towns and farming areas. If you will, John Murray was Universalism's first itinerant missionary. Universalism spread mostly through grassroots work by Murray and others who took up his mission all across the United States. Because these towns were small and didn't have a lot of money, the ministers were usually not educated. They were filled with purpose, and they were devout and spiritual people. They preached from the heart, even if their minds were not as educated. The word universalism came from their belief that everyone was saved and that God was love. There's our universalists. On the other hand, the left hand, they were both left, but on the other hand were the Unitarians. Contrary to being the religion of the simple farmers, Unitarianism first originated with the King of Transylvania in 1568, who was an ardent supporter of religious tolerance. Other influences of Unitarianism can be traced through the Reformation movement in England. And while the Universalists can spread from small town to small town and went west as the United States grew, Unitarianism was focused predominantly around Boston and was supported by Harvard Divinity School, where the majority of Unitarian ministers were trained. The Unitarian congregation members were often the elite of Boston society, rational, intellectual, and privileged. They were many of our founding fathers, no matter what the right tells you. Harriet Beecher Stowe summed them up when she wrote this in 1826. All the literary men of Massachusetts were Unitarian. All the trustees and professors of Harvard College were Unitarians. All the elite of wealth and fashion crowded Unitarian churches. The judges on the bench were Unitarians. Whereas the Universalists were deeply spiritual, the Unitarians were all about the mind and the power of reason. And one of their main focuses was challenging the idea of the Trinity. They believed God was one, hence the name Unitarian. So we have two liberal faiths that were both rejecting some of the most primary traditional tenets of Christianity. Through the 1800s and 1900s, they had more and more in common theologically and philosophically. They both strongly believed that people had the freedom to believe what they wanted and that their personal conscience should dictate their beliefs in the world. As such, they both refused to have a creed or a statement of belief as a necessity for membership. Members of both groups believed it was more important to be moral and good in this life than count on an afterlife. Both were on the cutting edge of progressive issues, although they did have their missteps. They were also both a refuge for Christians who wanted to leave their tradition and find a religion that better fit their values. They had so much in common. And as other Christian traditions became less strict about the creed, there was less that was differentiating about Unitarians and Universalists. There were so many reasons for them to merge. There were meetings and discussions about it for approximately 100 years. But it never happened. Why? It mostly came down to class. The Unitarians thought the Universalists were uneducated and that their ministers didn't have the degrees that they found so important. They thought the Universalists were too theologically conservative and too emotional. Conversely, the Universalists thought the Unitarians were too rational, elite, and snooty. They feared that their traditions and beliefs would be subsumed by the Unitarians. Basically, they both suffered from the belief that the other side was not like them. For almost 100 years, a merger was rejected because these issues could not be overcome. It is important to stop here and note that Americans of the 18th and 19th century didn't talk about classism or really any of these isms that we understand the way that we do now. For the first 100 years of our country's history, racism wasn't even a word that people used, and slavery was the law of the land. While many Unitarians and Universalists took up the abolitionist positions leading up to the Civil War and afterwards, let us be clear and acknowledge that many of them benefited from slavery before that, and slavery was a great topic of debate in both denominations. And sexism wasn't even acknowledged in either of these denominations until the late 20th century. In fact, it wasn't even until the early 1980s that the language in our Unitarian Universalist hymns and readings was addressed, because it was all about man. So classism wasn't acknowledged or discussed, much less any of those, even though it was definitely there. So let's get back to our story, shall we? Let me give you a good example of the differences in class between these two groups. Each of these denominations saw a lot of growth in the early 1800s, partly due to great leaders in their denomination. For the Unitarians, it was William Ellery Channing, and for the Universalists, it was Hosea Ballou. They were born only 9 years apart, 1780 and 1771, respectively. They both lived in Boston, and they were both prolific writers and passionate about their beliefs. Ballou was preaching about universal salvation, and Channing was preaching about the importance of human dignity and the free mind. They were pushing the theologies of their denominations into new and uncharted territory. They were both preaching in prominent pulpits in Boston for more than 25 years. We know that they knew about each other because they mentioned each other's positions in their sermons. But there is no record of them ever meeting. Why? Most likely because Channing lived on the fancy side of Boston, while Ballou lived in a more modest part of town near the Charles River. There seemed to be derision of each on both sides. There is documentation of some Boston elite Unitarians making fun of Ballou's rough and refined dialect and language. Hosea Ballou, on the other hand, noted the derision of he and his fellow Universalists, especially in their educational differences. He quoted that the Unitarians thought the Universalists were little better than barbarians when compared with the graduates of Harvard College and other polished literati. The difference between the two denominations was also described by Thomas Starr King, who actually straddled both groups. He was the rare person. He was raised in the Universalist church, and then he became a minister of a Unitarian church as an adult. He had a famous quote that summed up the difference between the two groups. He refers to the Universalists first and then to the Unitarians. The one thinks God is too good to damn them forever, and the other thinks that they are too good to be damned. So let me give away the ending of the story as if you didn't already know it. The Unitarians and the Universalists merged on this day in 1961, and we became one denomination with a really long name. But you could argue that the Universalists' concerns that their practices, their ministers, and beliefs would be subsumed by the elite Unitarians were realized. Our current denomination, I fear, often looks more like the Unitarians than the Universalists. Overall, we are a very well-educated denomination with a very high index of members holding higher education degrees. There is still controversy, and it is reignited about what the threshold is to become a Unitarian Universalist minister. The minimum cost for an MDiv and everything associated with it is $85,000. The majority of our congregations are in bigger cities rather than rural communities. In many denominations, the use of reason is seen as a higher value than the intuitive connection with the Spirit, although that is changing. You could say that we're an NPR kind of crowd. Now, this congregation, I'm very proud to say, is actually more economically economically diverse than many, but many in this room may not realize it or embrace it as fully as we could. So are we classist as a denomination now? Are we classist as individuals? Well, you can make that determination for yourself, but I can say it is something that we should think about. Let me ask you this. Have you ever scoffed at a Walmart shopper for being unaware of their purchasing power on the dynamics of small businesses that often have higher costs? Do you judge people who eat several times a week at McDonald's and depend on a dollar menu? While we may want to defend the health and the economic and animal rights, so many other issues that help inform our choices, I challenge you to ask if your opinions about others are based on the sense that you know better and may have a more informed perspective. I'm not saying that you should change your shopping habits. I am saying that we should all look at our motivations for judging or othering people. So what do we do about any of this? Well, I often say that the first step is acknowledging our biases, similar to the first step of any recovery program. We need to acknowledge that we might have a problem. The most difficult challenge we have in dealing with any of the isms, and it is a lifetime discovery and unpacking for many of us, is noticing when it is happening and being aware that we're doing it. Because any time we do any kind of othering in order to make ourselves feel better, we are furthering the cause of oppression and discrimination. And despite our history, we want to be the record disruptors, not the, oh, we did the bad thing, right? I don't believe that's who we wish to be. So how can we fully embrace our principles to see the worthiness and dignity of all people? How can we make our congregations more welcoming, this congregation more radically welcoming? I would argue that by becoming aware of the issues of class, we can also better address the issues of racism and sexism and income inequality and all of the other sources of oppression. Our history is not exempt of differences. In fact, it is defined by it. We have the opportunity to learn from it, to grow, to rise above it. There is so much to love about Unitarian Universalism, and there is so much to learn from it. In his essay entitled The Community of Man, Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, "As long as there is poverty in the world, I can never be rich, even if I have $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people in this world cannot expect to live more than 28 or 30 years, I can never be totally healthy, even if I just got a good checkup at Mayo Clinic. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. This is the way our world is made. No individual or nation can stand out boasting of being independent. We are interdependent." So ends his quote. May we recognize the rainbow of humanity that we all are. Each of us brings to this congregation a set of traits and skills and know-how and resources which enrich all of us. We are remarkably different, and as King says, we give others a better chance to be who they are and what they ought to be. So might that be in our little corner of the world, so might it be in our denomination, and so might it be in the world. Amen, and blessed be.